Hello readers, I'm David Ruder and today we're reviewing The Future of Geography, written by Tim Marshall in 2023. So this is actually a newly released Geopolitics book. It came out in late April of this year and I've read almost all of Tim Marshall's books so far. This is my sixth Tim Marshall book and I must say, of all the Tim Marshall books I've read so far, this is my favorite. I think this book is a perfect introduction to the geopolitics of space. It's a short book, about 240 pages, so it's a pretty quick read. And this book is divided into three parts, so the past, the present, and the future. And I'm gonna mainly focus on the present section, but starting with the past section. So in the past section, Tim Marshall gives a brief history of astronomy. So he mentions how the calendar in ancient civilizations was created based on astronomy. He talks about Galileo and different other scientists. He then moves on to some other relevant scientists such as Wernher von Braun. And then he gives a brief account of the Cold War space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I did not realize this before really, but initially the Soviets were winning the space race as they were the first country to put a man into orbit in space. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin. But the United States, of course, won the space race in 1969 when Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And after that the Americans had several more moon missions, and the last one was in December 1972. And since that time the world has not sent a human to the moon in the past 50 years. And of course, after losing the space race, the Soviets pretended that they never participated and that it was a one-man race. Now let's move on to the most interesting part of the book, the present section. So first, Tim Marshall talks about astropolitics. So here's one interesting fact about space science. The most efficient place to launch rockets into space is the nearer the better to the equator, because it requires less fuel and it's cheaper. So that's why France has its space program in French Guiana, that's why the United States has their space program in Florida, and that's why Russia has their space program in Kazakhstan. Definitions varies of where space starts. So one definition has space starting at 80 kilometers above sea level, another definition has space starting 100 kilometers above sea level. And also in the past decades you've had the shared International Space Station between several powers, or the ISS. This is a program that is operated by the United States, Russia, Japan, Canada, and the European Space Agency. The United States and the Russians specifically have sent up a lot of astronauts there. Another interesting fact about space is that you have these Lagrange points, which are advantageous places for you to have your satellites in space, as the gravitational pull of two different places cancel out. So I guess there's some kind of weird equilibrium thing. So you can basically park your satellites there. And there are a handful of these in space, and this may be where future geopolitical powers may want to place their satellites. And then Tim Marshall talks about the different levels of orbit. So you have low Earth orbit, mid Earth orbit, and high Earth orbit. And one relevant thing now to space geopolitics, and one fact about space geopolitics, is that satellites are now crucial to security deterrence, and they're also an aspect of different militaries. So if, for example, the nuclear deterrence system now works in part through having a satellite that can notice if there's a nuclear attack and warn the country of it. So if that satellite becomes impaired, ever becomes impaired, there may be a preemptive strike. And then Tim Marshall talks about that there aren't any good, clear international agreements relating to space. So a few treaties that do exist are the Moon Agreement and Artemis, but neither the Chinese or the Russians are part of either of these, and the United States is not part of the Moon Agreement, and also these agreements are quite often vague. So Tim Marshall argues that we need legal agreements that have clearer definitions of what different things are, and they need to include the major powers, of course, and these are the big three. And the big three powers in space are the United States, China, and Russia. And Tim Marshall talks a bit about the moon, and we will have soon new moon visits. The Chinese will eventually visit the moon. I think the United States is also probable to return to the moon someday. The thing is that the moon has a lot of potential resources for Earth. So for example, if I understood correctly, the moon has ice, which means that you can get water from there. So of course that's one element of creating oxygen in space. And then the moon has lots of helium-3, which according to some could meet energy demands for the next 10,000 years. So if technology advances fast enough and the science works, our energy crisis may be solved thanks to moon energy, basically. But this is not something that's gonna happen soon. Sometime in the next decades, maybe, if we're lucky. Of course, there are some who have ambitions to go to Mars and colonize it. So for example, Elon Musk and SpaceX wanna create a city there in a few decades. Oh, of course, in recent years, you have had space tourism for very rich people. So if you wanna visit space, you can do that, you just need to pay $500,000. But of course, costs will probably decrease over time, which means that the middle class in a few decades will probably be able to visit space. That sounds cool, that someone like me or other people could visit space maybe relatively cheaply, maybe, I don't know, in 40, 50 years. Then Tim Marshall talks about the big three players in space. So first of all, you have China, who wants to become the leader in space for the benefit, so-called, of all of mankind. So whenever China does something now in geopolitics, they claim that they're doing it for the benefit of all of humanity, but they want to lead. And Russia's space program has been in relative decline, and the Ukraine war isolated Russia from the West. So the International Space Station is gonna be discontinued in a few years, and you will no longer have this shared space science between the West and Russia. And the West has used some Russian technology when flying up to space and have done so from Kazakhstan. But now the West, the USA, they're diversifying away from Russia. So Russia is gonna become an isolated power in space, and they're gonna instead start collaborating with China and become China's junior party. So you're gonna have two main blocks, the Sino-Russian bloc and then the American-led bloc. And currently the USA is still the main leader in space. They have by far the most satellites, I believe. Although a lot of other countries have lots of satellites now in space, dozens and dozens. And the USA has recently recognized space as a potential dimension for war and the military. So in recent years, they created the Space Force as a branch of the armed forces of the United States military. Then Tim Marshall talks about some other potential space powers. So you have the European Space Agency, which is a bunch of European countries collaborating over space, but a lot of them are in practice going at it alone. The European Space Agency, or ESA, are largely aligned with the USA, and different minor space powers around the world in the Middle East, such as the UAE or African countries or countries in Asia or Latin America, they are gonna side broadly with two different blocks. Either they're gonna side with the USA space bloc, or they're gonna side with the Sino-Russian space bloc. And then Tim Marshall moves on to the third section in his book, which is about the future. So now he talks about potential wars in space. So one potential war could, for example, be over Taiwan, and satellites, of course, indicate if the Chinese Navy is approaching Taiwan in a certain way. Of course, as the satellites are part of the nuclear deterrence system, if a satellite attacks another satellite, oh, by the way, the satellites are militarized, they have guns to protect themselves, so they can shoot at each other in theory. If a Russian satellite starts bullying an American satellite, which jams its nuclear deterrence system, then you could have another potential Cuban Missile Crisis. So there's a possibility that these space politics could lead to another near-nuclear exchange. So what is Tim Marshall's conclusion to this book? He believes that space is becoming more relevant to present geopolitics. I agree with him. And he believes that there are going to be lots of important developments in space in the coming decades. So probably you're going to see a lot of things happening with the moon, and possibly you may even see some things happen with Mars in the coming decades. And that's the book. So how would I rate The Future of Geography by Tim Marshall? I'm gonna give it a 9 out of 10. This is my favorite Tim Marshall book. This is just a perfect blend of astronomy, history, and of space geopolitics. And of course, Tim Marshall has a neo-realist approach to analyzing these geopolitics, but he also believes in the importance of treaties. And of course, probably this space exploration is gonna be beneficial for all of mankind. You learn a lot of interesting things about space through reading this book, and also about the space competition in international relations between major powers, so the big three, the USA, Russia, and China. And also it talks about some of the minor powers, how they play into this. And it also talks a bit about a few private companies and what they're doing in space. So for example, it talks about a couple different visions by billionaires in space. So you have Elon Musk's SpaceX, which wants to go to Mars. And then you have Jeff Bezos, who wants to do some hotel thing in orbit near Earth. There's a lot of interesting stuff in this book. Would I recommend you to read The Future of Geography? Definitely. This is one of the best geopolitics books overall that I've read so far. If you want to learn about another book about geopolitical rivalry, then I would recommend you to check out my book review of The Avoidable War by Kevin Rudd, which is about the current Sino-American geopolitical tensions. Anyways, I'm the avid reader, and I will see readers next time.